A woman who had buried a husband, sold a farm, and crossed 3 state lines didn't expect much from a cattle rancher who couldn't be bothered to write more than 2 sentences at a time. What she got was worse than she expected and better than she deserved. And by the time she understood which was which, it was already spring. Sadie Coll stepped off the stage at Dunmore, Wyoming, on a Thursday in late April, with a trunk that was heavier than it looked, and a letter she'd read so many times the ink had started to thin. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, which was saying something, because she hadn't imagined it large. A main street with a general store, a post office that shared its building with a harness shop, a church at the far end that needed painting, and a saloon that didn't. The mountains sat behind all of it like they'd been there longer than the idea of towns, and would be there long after. She stood on the stage platform and waited. The other passengers dispersed. A man in a good coat was collected by a woman and 2 children. A traveling salesman headed for the saloon without looking left or right. A young couple moved off together, talking in low voices about something that pleased them both. Sadie was not collected. She waited 20 minutes. Then she picked up her trunk by one handle and dragged it across the platform to the shade of the overhang, and sat on it and looked at the letter again, though she already knew what it said. Come on the Thursday stage. I'll be there, or send someone. Callum Foss. He had not been there. He had not sent someone. She found the general store. The woman behind the counter had gray hair pinned back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped caring about the arrangement and started caring only about function. She looked at Sadie the way people look at someone they've been half expecting but weren't sure would actually arrive. You'll be the one for Foss, the woman said. Not a question. Sadie Coll, Sadie said. Is there someone who can tell me how to get to his property? The woman, her name turned out to be Pearl Gideon. She ran the store with her son, who was somewhere in the back, came around the counter and looked Sadie over with the frank assessment of someone who wasn't going to pretend she wasn't doing it. 6 miles north, Pearl said. Follow the main road until you cross the wooden bridge, then take the right fork. You'll see the property before you see the house. There's a big red bluff behind it. Can't miss it. Is there a horse I can hire? Pearl looked at the clock on the wall. She looked at Sadie. She went to the back and said something in a low voice, and a young man appeared, maybe 19, with hay in his hair and the look of someone who'd been asleep until a moment ago. My son Eli can take you in the wagon, Pearl said. He's going that direction anyway. He wasn't going that direction. Sadie could tell from the way he looked at his mother. But she wasn't going to argue with a kindness. She loaded her trunk into the wagon and sat up front beside Eli, who drove without speaking, which suited her. She used the time to look at the land. It was different from Kansas. Kansas was flat and open, sky in every direction, the kind of country that made you feel exposed. This was different. The mountains were present in a way that Kansas sky never was. Not background, but foreground, a weight on the horizon that changed the quality of the air. The grass was shorter, the soil rockier, the road less forgiving. She'd been a farmer's wife in Kansas for 8 years. She knew what working land looked like, what it looked like when it was being worked well, and what it looked like when someone had stopped paying attention to it. She started seeing the second thing before Eli pulled the wagon off the main road. The fence line along the left side ran ragged, posts tilted, a long section of wire dragging in the scrub grass. A gate at the field entrance hung from one hinge. The irrigation ditch that ran parallel to the road was silted up in several places, the water moving sluggishly where it moved at all. Eli said nothing, but she noticed he didn't look at the fence. The house came into view around a stand of cottonwoods, 2 stories, which surprised her. She'd expected a single story, a working man's house. This had been built by someone with ambition, or by someone for someone with ambition, and then time had gotten to it. The paint had gone gray and was peeling at every corner. The porch sagged on the right side. A window on the second floor had been covered with board rather than glass. A dog came out from under the porch and barked twice, then lay back down. A man appeared in the doorway. He was taller than she'd expected, which wasn't what she noticed first. What she noticed first was that he looked like someone who had recently been reminded of something unpleasant. He stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides and looked at the wagon and then at her, and his expression did not change. You're Sadie Coll, he said when she climbed down. I am. You didn't come. He had the decency not to make an excuse immediately. He looked at the ground for a moment, then at her. He was somewhere in his early 40s, dark-haired going silver, with hands that had been working for a long time, and a jaw that was considering a beard. He wore a canvas coat with a split seam at the shoulder that hadn't been mended. "One of the mares got into something in the north pasture," he said. "I was with her most of the morning. Is she all right?" He looked slightly surprised by the question. "She'll be fine. Had to stay with her. Then that was the right call," Sadie said. She turned to Eli and thanked him. He helped her trunk to the ground, nodded once at Callum Foss without quite meeting his eyes, and drove back the way they'd come. Sadie looked at the house. She looked at the fence line she could see from here, and the barn behind the house, and the lean-to beside the barn that had partially collapsed on one side. "I'd like to see everything," she said. "The house first, and then the land." Callum Foss looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected something different and was recalculating. "You just arrived." "I know when I arrived," Sadie said. "I'd like to see the house." He let her in. The inside was what you got when one person had lived alone in a space built for more than one. Functional but not tended. A main room with a stone fireplace, and too many coats on too few hooks, and a floor that hadn't been properly swept in at least 2 weeks. The kitchen was cleaner. This was a man who understood the necessity of a working kitchen, but the pantry was thin. She opened the door and looked at the shelves without commenting. Flour, salt, some dried beans, 3 jars of something she couldn't identify. A side of bacon hanging from a hook that was more fat than meat. On the mantel over the fireplace, there was a photograph. A woman younger than Sadie, with light hair and a serious expression. Standing beside her, a girl of maybe 6 or 7. Sadie looked at it long enough to register it, then looked away. "What do you owe on the land?" she said. He stopped moving behind her. She heard the pause. "That's direct," he said. "I need to understand what I'm working with," he told her. The number was not catastrophic, but it was close enough to the edge of catastrophic that she could see it from where she was standing. She wrote it in the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. He watched her write it. "What are you doing?" he said. "Keeping track." "Of what?" "Of the problem," she said. "It's easier to solve a problem you've written down." He was quiet for a moment. "The correspondence agency said you were a farm wife in Kansas. 8 years. My husband passed 14 months ago. The farm went to debt. I had time to figure out what came next, and I answered your advertisement." He was leaning against the doorframe between the kitchen and the main room, his arms crossed, watching her the way people watch something they're not sure about yet. She didn't mind being watched. She was doing the same to him. "I should tell you," he said. "The 2 women before you. One came and looked at the place and left in 3 days. The other stayed 2 weeks and then went back to her sister in Missouri." "I'm not going back anywhere," Sadie said. "I don't have a sister in Missouri." Something crossed his face. Not quite relief. The shadow of relief. "Supper," he said. "I'll make something." "I'll help," she said. "I want to see what you have to work with." He had salt pork and dried corn and a small amount of flour. She made cornbread and stretched the salt pork with the dried corn into something that constituted a meal, and they ate at the kitchen table in the fading light with the kind of silence that belongs to 2 people who don't know each other and haven't yet decided what they think. "How many head?" she asked, when the food was half gone. 14 cattle, was 18, lost 4 to a fever last fall. He picked up his coffee. 2 horses, some chickens, I don't know the count. They've been running wild around the barn. "Chickens that run wild don't lay well," she said. "I know. Do you have a coop?" "Half of one." He looked at his cup. The far wall came down in the winter wind. "I haven't gotten to it." She wrote that down too. He watched her write it. "You write everything down," he said. "Everything I can't afford to forget." He was quiet. Outside the window, the last of the April light was going pink over the bluffs, and somewhere in the scrub to the north, a coyote started and started again. The dog under the porch stirred at the sound and settled. "The photograph on the mantel," Sadie said. She hadn't meant to say it that soon, but the question was there, and the silence had made room for it. His hand stopped moving on the coffee cup. "My wife, Ellen," he said, "and my daughter, Nettie." He didn't elaborate. She waited. 3 years ago, there was a flooding of the river in the spring. Ellen and Nettie were caught on the south crossing. The bridge couldn't hold it. He said it the way people say things they've said enough times that the words have worn smooth. The feeling under them hadn't worn smooth. You could tell. Ellen was 29. Nettie was 7. "I'm sorry," Sadie said. He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting condolence he's accepted many times and hasn't found a better response to. I'm not here to replace them, Sadie said quietly. It needed saying, so she said it. He looked at her across the table. His eyes were dark, brown, steady, and difficult to read. I know that, he said. She lay in the upstairs room that night, the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, plain walls, a narrow bed, a window that looked out toward the bluffs, and went through what she'd seen. The picture that assembled itself was not good. The land was capable, she could see that. The soil on the south slope where the water drained well was dark and rich. The creek that ran along the west boundary was reliable. She'd seen the watermarks on the bank, a decent, consistent flow. But the irrigation work was neglected, the fencing was failing, and the house was losing heat through every gap in the mortar that one man alone hadn't found the time to address. None of it was irreparable. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not one item on her list was beyond fixing. It was just beyond fixing by one person doing everything at once. She added 2 more things to her notebook before she slept. Check the irrigation ditch at the west field, and below it, chickens. Coop, feed, count. She was up before dawn. She rebuilt the kitchen fire and had coffee on before she heard Callum's boots on the stairs. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her standing at the window with the pot already warm. You're up, he said. Always. She handed him a cup without ceremony. The fire in the main room, the damper needs adjusting. You're burning through wood too fast. He looked toward the main room. I've had it that way for a winter. It's burning wrong. You're losing heat. She poured her own cup and stood at the window, looking at the pre-dawn shape of the land. What's first for you this morning? Check the mare. Then the cattle in the north pasture. I'll count the chickens and look at the coop situation. Then I want to walk the irrigation ditch. He looked at her. You don't have to start today. I started last night, she said. There were 11 chickens. She counted them twice to be sure, working her way around the barn and the collapsed lean to where 3 of them had apparently decided to live. They were thin and nervy, and 2 of them had the dull-eyed look of birds not getting enough nutrition. The half-coop that remained was barely shelter. The missing wall let in wind from the north, and the bedding was old and damp. She picked up one of the thin hens and checked its feet. Mites, probably. She set the bird down and noted it. She walked the irrigation ditch after that. It was worse than she'd thought from the road. Nearly a third of it was silted up or blocked with debris from the spring runoff. Not complicated to fix, but time-consuming, and time was the thing this property was most short of. Callum found her at the ditch mid-morning. He came across the south field with his coat open and mud on his boots, and looked at what she was doing. It's blocked in 3 places, she said. Probably more farther up. I know. He crouched down and looked at the worst section, where a pile of dead brush and river debris had turned a functioning channel into a muddy mess. Last fall I got to 2 of them. Then the fence on the east side needed doing, and I didn't come back to it. How many acres could this water if it ran right? He told her. She did the math against what she'd seen of the soil quality. That's enough for a real kitchen garden and a crop plot, she said. Potatoes especially, the soil's right for it. He was quiet, turning a stick over in his hand. She'd noticed he did that, picked up whatever was nearby when he was thinking and worked it with his hands. A stick, a fence nail, the handle of a tool. That was Ellen's plan, he said. The garden. She had a whole layout for it. Where? Sadie said. He looked at her. Show me where she planned it, Sadie said. If she knew this land, she knew the right spots. I don't want to put things in the wrong place. He was still for a long moment. Then he stood and pointed. The south-facing flat between the house and the ditch. She said the light was right there and the slope would drain it well. Sadie looked at the flat. He was right. Ellen had been right. The angle and the drainage were good. That's where I'll put it, she said. He looked at the flat too. He didn't say anything else. But she noticed something in his posture that was different from a few minutes earlier. Some held things setting down. They walked back to the house for midday without talking much. At the porch, she stopped and looked at the sagging right side. The support post has rotted at the base, she said. I know. If you have lumber, I can sister a new post in beside it. It doesn't need to be pretty, just sound. He looked at her with the expression she was starting to recognize, a recalibration. A man updating what he thought he was dealing with. I have lumber in the barn, he said. After dinner, she said, and went inside to make it. The porch took them 2 hours that afternoon. She'd done this kind of repair before, not often. But she understood the principle, and she had good hands, and she wasn't afraid of a hammer. He did the heavier work, the old post out and the new one positioned, and she held and nailed, and they didn't have to talk much because the work communicated well enough on its own. When it was done, he stood back and tested the porch boards with his weight. Solid. Better, he said. It'll hold another 10 years, she said. Longer if you paint it. He almost made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Not quite, but close. That was the first week. Not dramatic. Nothing solved. Nothing finished. The list in her notebook kept getting longer as she found more things to add. The barn door needed rehinging. The upstairs window with the board over it needed glass before next winter. The east fence line was in worse condition than the west, and the west was already on the list. But she got 9 eggs from the 11 hens by the end of the week, after she cleaned out the old bedding, cleared a space in the partially standing coop where they could dust bathe even in the limited dry area, and switched them to a better grain mix she traded Pearl Gideon for with the promise of eggs in return. The week before, according to Callum, he'd gotten 2. He came in from the barn on Saturday morning and set the egg count on the counter without comment. She saw him look at it for a moment before he went to wash his hands. The way he looked at it, careful, like he was checking that the number was real, said more than a comment would have. Pearl Gideon became her point of information the way Vera Aldert had been for other women in other places. Sadie rode into Dunmore on a Monday, the second week, ostensibly to buy grain and salt and to return a borrowed horse blanket she'd found in the barn with Pearl's initials on it. She stayed 2 hours. Pearl's store served as the quiet clearinghouse of the valley. Everything that happened passed through it eventually, and Pearl had the quality of someone who listened without seeming to and remembered without seeming to remember. She showed Sadie which seed suppliers were reliable and which ones sold old stock with inflated germination rates. She told her about the flooding 3 years ago, told her carefully, watching Sadie's face while she did it, and what it had done to Callum Foss afterward. Not just the grief, the particular kind of stoppage that grief can cause in a practical man when the work that used to keep him functional stopped keeping him functional, because the person he'd been working toward was gone. He let things go, Pearl said. It wasn't a criticism. She said it the way a doctor describes a symptom, piece by piece. The way things go when you stop catching them. He didn't stop working. Sadie said, no, but there's working and there's working towards something. He lost the second one for a while. Sadie looked at the grain prices Pearl had written out for her on a slip of paper. Do you think he's found it again? Pearl looked at her over the counter with the steady gaze of a woman who had known Callum Foss for 20 years and was making an assessment. I think he might, she said. Depends. On what? On whether you stay. Sadie folded the slip of paper and put it in her coat pocket. I'm staying, she said. Pearl nodded once, in the way of someone who doesn't give approval easily and doesn't waste it when she does. Come look at the seed section, she said. I'll tell you what does well up here. There was a man in the store when Sadie was about to leave. She heard the door and turned. He was well dressed for Dunmore, a wool coat that cost more than most people here spent on coats, and the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to before he finished his sentences. He had a trimmed gray beard and pale eyes that moved over the room with the practiced ease of someone keeping inventory. He looked at Sadie and then at Pearl. Pearl, he said, is that the Foss woman? Sadie Coll, Pearl said neutrally. The man came forward and introduced himself as Harwood Crane. He owned, Pearl had mentioned, the largest grazing operation in the county and several thousand acres along the eastern valley. He shook Sadie's hand with the firm, brief handshake of a man who shakes hands for information. The Foss place, Harwood said. Good land up there. How are you finding it? It needs work, Sadie said. We're doing it. Something adjusted in his expression. Very small. A recalibration. Callum's a hard worker, Harwood said, with the tone of a man paying a compliment and meaning something adjacent to it. It's been a tough few years for him. A lot of smaller operations have found it sensible to consolidate. He paused. If the timing were ever right for a conversation about the South Parcel, it isn't, Sadie said. But I'll let him know you said hello. Pearl was looking at the counter when Sadie turned back around, but there was something at the corner of her mouth. Harwood Crane, Sadie said, when the door closed. Watches the struggling places, Pearl said, like a man at an auction before the auction starts. Sadie rode back to the property thinking about Harwood Crane's eyes and the particular way he'd said consolidate. She'd met men like him before, not in land but in credit and debt. The way they waited at the edge of someone's difficulty, patient and reasonable sounding, until the difficulty got large enough. She didn't say anything to Callum that evening. She needed to think it through. What she found, when she sat down that night and went through everything she knew about the property's finances, was that the picture was tighter than Callum had implied, not because he'd been dishonest. She didn't think Callum Foss was a dishonest man, but there was a way that people deep in difficulty sometimes couldn't look directly at the number, because looking at it directly led somewhere they couldn't afford to go. She looked at it directly. She was still looking at it when she heard him come in from checking the barn. He saw the notebook open and the way she was sitting, upright, not tired, the particular posture of someone who's found something, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway. "What is it?" he said. She told him, not dramatically, just clearly. All of it, the debt figure against the cattle value, the cost of getting through to fall, the fence repairs that couldn't wait versus the ones that could, the way the numbers currently sat. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat down at the table across from her and was quiet for a while. "I knew it was close," he said finally. "You knew the pieces," she said. "I'm not sure you'd looked at them all at once." He turned his coffee cup on the table. "Know the cattle. How many do you expect to be market weight by fall? 11 if we don't lose any more. At current prices, 11 head clears the debt and leaves something. Not much, but something." She paused. "If we lose 2 more, we don't clear it. I know Callum." She waited until he looked at her. "There's a man named Harwood Crane who came into Pearl's store today. He mentioned the south parcel. His face went the way faces go when a name arrives that's been expected. A door closing against a draft. He's been patient," Callum said. "He's been waiting," she said. "There's a difference. Waiting means he expects things to get worse. We need to make sure they don't." He was quiet for a long time. His hands on the table were still, the way hands get when the body is very focused. "The south parcel is the best land I have," he said. "The creek feeds it. The soil on the flat. You've seen the flat." "I know what it is," she said. "I'm not suggesting selling it. I'm suggesting we don't give him a reason to come back with a better offer at a worse moment." She looked at her notebook. "The cattle need to stay healthy. The east fence has to hold so we don't get into a dispute on that side. The irrigation has to run properly so the hayfield produces." He looked at her. "So we work," she said. "Yes," he said. "We work." The word we sat between them like something that had been set down carefully. Neither of them commented on it. The man named Aldous Kane, a neighbor, sheep country, 3 miles south, a person who said nothing unless it needed saying, and occasionally said things that didn't need saying at all, but happened to be right, materialized at the east fence line one morning in early May when Sadie and Callum were working the worst section. He came across his own field with a post hole digger over his shoulder and said nothing in the way of greeting, just began digging the next hole down the line. They worked alongside him for 3 hours without discussing it. When they were done with the section, he looked at the fence, nodded once, and went back to his own property. "He's done that before?" Sadie said. 2 or 3 times, Callum said. "Does he expect something in return?" "He'll need help with his shearing in July. I'll go." She thought about that system for the rest of the afternoon. The invisible accounting of people who lived far enough from town that formal arrangements were too slow. A different kind of economy running on obligation and memory instead of ledgers. She started a second notebook in May. The first was for problems. The second was for the garden. She broke ground on the south-facing flat the first week of May, turning the soil with a fork, and then with a borrowed plow that Callum hitched to the bay mare. The soil was what she'd hoped, dark, with good body to it, not the thin sandy stuff she'd fought in Kansas. It turned well. It had been resting long enough to recover from whatever Ellen had last put into it. There was a small shed on the side of the house that Sadie hadn't been in yet. Not from avoidance, exactly. More from a sense that some things needed time before they were approached. She opened it one afternoon in the second week of May. It was organized the way a person's shed is organized when they plan to come back to it. Tools on their hooks. Seed packets on a shelf, dated and sorted. A pair of gloves folded on the potting table. She looked at the seed packets without touching them. Most were too old now, 3 years past their best viability. But there were 2 at the end of the row that were newer. Field squash, 1882, 1 year before the flood. She took the packets and stood in the small space that smelled of earth and old wood, and thought about Ellen Foss, who had organized this shelf and folded these gloves and planned a garden she hadn't gotten to plant. There was grief in the room, but there was also intention, and the intention was still there in the arrangement of things. A woman who plans returns. Ellen hadn't gotten to. That wasn't the same as the plan being wrong. Sadie put the seed packets in her coat pocket and went to find Callum. He was at the barn, working on the door hinge she'd put on the list in the first week. "I went into the shed," she said. He straightened and looked at her. "I found seed packets," she said. "Ellen's, from 2 years before. There are 2 that might still be viable. Field squash. They hold a long time if they've been stored dry." She held them out. "I want to try them in the east bed, if that's all right." He looked at the packets in her hand. He looked at the handwriting on them. His face did the complicated thing it sometimes did, carrying several things at once without releasing any of them. "She always said that flat was the right spot for squash," he said. "The way the afternoon light hits it." "She was right about that," Sadie said. "I'd like to honor that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, try them." She put them in the ground the following morning. Harwood Crane came to the property in June. Not with an offer this time, though the offer was underneath everything he said. He came with a boundary question, a water rights matter involving the creek easement on the western edge. A question that had apparently not concerned him during the years when the property was most vulnerable, and that had surfaced now with suspicious convenience. Callum met him on the porch. This time Sadie was beside him without being asked, and Callum hadn't asked her to stand elsewhere, which was its own statement. Harwood Crane's eyes moved between them. He was good at adjusting without appearing to adjust. The water rights question, as Sadie had expected, was pretextual. The language of the original land filing was clear enough. She knew because she'd found the filing documents in the box of household papers she'd organized in her first week, and she'd read them twice. "The creek easement is defined in the original filing," she said, when Harwood raised the question. 30 feet from the western bank. The Foss property line is 40 feet from the bank. There's no encroachment. She kept her voice conversational. "I can show you the document if it's useful." Harwood looked at her with the patient expression of a man accustomed to patience. "That won't be necessary," he said. "I may have been working from an older survey, probably the one from before Callum filed his claim," she said. "The 1879 version. The 1881 filing supersedes it." A pause of about 5 seconds that contained several conversations nobody was going to have allowed. Then Harwood picked up his hat. "Place is looking better," he said, to both of them and neither of them. "It is," Callum said. After the sound of Harwood's horse faded down the road, Callum stood at the porch railing and looked at the view for a long moment. The south flat with the garden in. The irrigation ditch running clear now, a month after she'd worked through all 6 blocked sections. The east fence line, tight and straight. The barn, its door hanging right for the first time in however long. "The filing documents," he said. "In the first week. I go through papers when I arrive somewhere new," she said. "I need to know what I'm working with." He turned and looked at her. The late afternoon light was doing the thing it did in June, warm and long, the bluffs going red in it. His face was different from the face she'd first seen in the doorway in April. Not younger, exactly, but less closed. The way land looks after good rain, when the surface opens up and you can see there's more underneath. "Sadie," he said. She waited. "I wrote that advertisement twice before," he said. "This is the 3rd time. I didn't expect it to be anything other than practical. Someone to help keep the place running. Someone so I wasn't doing it alone." "I know," she said. "I came for the same reason." "And now," he said. He stopped. He wasn't a man who found the right words quickly, and she'd learned not to push that. "And now it's more than that." She looked at him. She knew what he was trying to say, and she thought he knew she knew. But there are things that need to be said aloud, even between people who are already saying them in every other way. "It is," she said. "I want to ask you something," Callum said. He looked at her with the directness she'd come to understand was the only gear he had for things that mattered to him. "Not about the arrangement, about whether this is something you want to be here for. Not because the land needs you, because I do." She thought about her husband, James. She thought about the 8 years in Kansas, the good years first, and then the years that were only good in comparison to the final one. She thought about the grief that had followed, which had been real, and which had changed shape over the 14 months since, until it was something she carried without it slowing her stride. James would have liked this valley. He would have looked at the bluffs and said something about the geology. He would have approved of Callum Foss's patience with broken things. "Yes," she said, "that's what I'm here for." He stepped toward her on the repaired porch, and the kiss was not the way people write about kisses. It was careful for a half second, the way first kisses are between two adults who know the weight of what they're choosing, and then it wasn't careful at all. And somewhere in the south field, the irrigation ditch ran with the clean sound of water moving right. They were married in Dunmore on a Saturday in late June, in the church at the far end of the main street that she'd noticed needed painting the day she arrived. Pearl Gideon stood witness. Aldous Kane came and sat in the back row and said nothing during the ceremony, which was everything you needed to know about Aldous Kane's feelings on the matter. The minister was brief and practical, which suited them both. Afterward, Pearl served coffee and a cake she'd made without being asked. Callum shook hands with the people who came and said less than anyone in the room. Sadie talked to the people he didn't quite get around to. They drove home in the wagon in the long June evening, not talking much, the mountains going purple in the last of the light. The field squash came up in July. She found the first shoots on a Wednesday morning, small and very green in the dark soil of the east bed, arranged in the rows she'd put them. She stood looking at them for longer than was practical. Then she went to find Callum. He was on the barn roof. They'd finally gotten to it, the soft spot she'd been watching since her second week. He came down the ladder when she called, reading her face. "Ellen's seeds," she said. He came to the garden and looked at the east bed. 8 plants, pushing up through the carefully mounded soil. She would have been pleased, he said. She'd have had a whole plan for what to do with them, Sadie said. She always did. He stood looking at them. She was the one who thought this property was worth saving. In the hard first years, I kept thinking we'd made a mistake coming out here, and she'd say, he stopped. She'd say you don't know what a place can do until it gets the chance to show you. Sadie looked at the 8 small plants in the dark soil. She thought about what it meant to come to a place that someone else had begun and not been able to finish, the difficulty of it, and the something else that ran underneath the difficulty. The sense of a thread picked up. "We'll know by October," she said. "Yes," he said. He reached over and took her hand, and they stood in the garden. In the July morning, the mountains behind them, the creek audible from the west field where the water was running clear and right through every section she'd cleared. The east fence line held. The 11 cattle were gaining weight in the north pasture. The chickens were giving 12 eggs a day from 11 hens, which Pearl had said was impressive, and which Sadie privately thought was just what happened when you paid attention to what birds needed. The place was not finished. The second-floor window still needed glass before winter. The west fence had 2 sections she'd be watching through the summer. There was always a next thing and a thing after that, and the ranch asked for them continuously, the way land does, without sentiment, without acknowledgement, always just the next task waiting. But the debt would clear with the fall cattle sale. Harwood Crane had not come back. The garden was in the ground and growing. The squash planted from Ellen's seeds was coming up in the east bed, and it was going to produce. She could already see it in the strength of the stems, in the way the leaves were opening toward the light. Some things outlast the people who started them. That was not a tragedy. It was, she thought, the most honest definition of what it meant to build something, to put it into ground that will keep going after you've gone, to hand the thread to whoever comes next and trust them to pull it in the right direction. She had come to this place with a trunk, a notebook, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had survived enough to stop being afraid of starting over. She had found a man who was still carrying everything he hadn't been able to put down, and they had, without much ceremony and without announcement, started carrying it together. That was the whole of it. Not the large moments, not the crisis survived, not even the spring after the hard winter. The whole of it was the ditch cleared 1 section at a time, and the nails counted, and the seeds pressed into soil that had been waiting 3 years for someone to try again. That was the thing that held. The ordinary work, done together, every day. The squash would be ready in September. She was already thinking about what came after.